Welcome to the Audacious Freedom Podcast, episode number 5, called Juneteenth, our new federal holiday. I am your host, Dee Dee Mendez. I am a storyteller, a perpetual student of self-development, and an audacious life liver, among many other areas of expertise and interests. I am most recently the founder of audaciousfreedom.com. I come to you, my listeners, with stories about what I learn, read, observe, and experience in the world today. I'm inspired by so many other storytellers, and I'm told I inspire others as well with my own stories. I was inspired to record today's podcast because President Joe Biden on June 17th, 2021, signed a law making Juneteenth a federal holiday. And within hours of it being signed into law, my company's CEO sent an email out to all employees that we would recognize the federal holiday the next day, Friday, June 18th, because this year in 2021, June 19th falls on a Saturday. I have so many emotions about this new federal holiday. And I think it's a step in the right direction for our country to begin to repair the racial injustice and police brutality against Black and Brown Americans. I chose to use this day off, and for those of you who can't see me, I'm making air quotes with my fingers. I chose to use this day off as a day to further educate myself about the history of Juneteenth, to rewatch 13th, the documentary by Ava DuVernay, which explores the history of racial inequality in the United States, and to finish reading Patrisse Khan-Cullor's book. Patrisse is a co-founder of the Black Lives Matter Global Network. So regarding Juneteenth, I learned that I wasn't the only American who didn't know much about Juneteenth until last year in 2020, when organizations and the media just began to introduce this little known piece of our history. Juneteenth is now officially known as Juneteenth National Independence Day and is historically known as Jubilee Day, Emancipation Day, Freedom Day, and Black Independence Day. Juneteenth originated in Galveston, Texas, and has been celebrated on June 19th in various parts of the U.S. since 1865. Juneteenth commemorates the anniversary date of the June 19th, 1865 announcement of General Order Number 3 by Union Army General Gordon Granger, proclaiming freedom for slaves in Texas, which was the last state of the Confederacy with institutional slavery. And 2.5 years after President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. In conversations with many people in the African American community after Juneteenth was made a federal holiday, I found out that many of them didn't know much about the history either. And many of them wanted to go back to their parents and ask them what they knew about Juneteenth from their own education and from their own childhood experiences. I did hear about some African Americans in the broader social media community, not people that I know or personally talked with, but those who grew up in Texas, that they celebrated Juneteenth every year. And instead of celebrating the 4th of July, they celebrated Juneteenth. I learned that traditional Juneteenth foods and drinks for celebration are red, like strawberry soda and red velvet cake. People also wear red clothing on the holiday. And the label on the Juneteenth strawberry soda says the sweet sip of freedom. I also learned that the red food traditions that you eat during the time of Juneteenth bring recognition to the bloodshed of the enslaved. Let me pause here for a minute. I've been trying to hold it together in my emotions about why we even need to celebrate Juneteenth, the date that proclaimed freedom for slaves in Texas, 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. That we fucking had slaves in the United States beginning as early as 1619. So before we were officially the United States, but on this continent. So for well over 200 years, it makes me so sick I can hardly breathe. What the fuck? And when I rewatched Ava DuVernay's 13th, I got upset and sick all over again. It's astonishing that the US has 5% of the world's population and yet 25% of the world's prisoners. DuVernay contends that slavery has been perpetuated since the end of the American Civil War through criminalizing behavior and enabling police to arrest poor freedmen for minor offenses, and then forces them to work when they can't pay the fines, to work for the state under convict leasing, which only created an incentive to criminalize more behavior. And the suppression of African Americans by disenfranchisement, lynchings, and Jim Crow legislation to legalize segregation and suppress minorities, forcing them into second-class status. And later, when politicians declared a war on drugs that jails white people for less time for powder cocaine and Black and brown people for much longer time for crack cocaine. By the late 20th century, mass incarceration affected communities of color, especially American descendants of slavery in the United States. And DuVernay examines and explains how much money is being made by corporations from the prison industrial complex and the emerging detention industrial complex. To be clear, private prison contractors entered the market to satisfy demand as arrests and sentences increased, forming an independent group with its own economic incentives to criminalize minor activities and lengthen sentences to keep prisons full. What the fuck? And politicians and businesses in rural areas encouraged construction of prisons to supply local jobs and have had incentives to keep prisons full. What the actual fuck? This greed from politicians and businessmen, this incarceration of adults, has severely damaged generations of Black and minority families and their children. Let that sink in America. This is disgusting. We should be ashamed of ourselves. This is not the fucking land of the free. And then I bless and I thank Patrisse Khan-Cullor for all her work and her book, When They Call You a Terrorist, A Story of Black Lives Matter and the Power to Change the World. The whole time I was reading this book, I couldn't put it down, even though I felt sick to my stomach and had a lump in my throat the whole time. Patrisse grew up in the 80s in LA and watched her brother and other young teens get arrested while hanging out in their neighborhood in front of their apartment building. Many of the kids had a father in jail, and Patrisse's mother was not at home. She was working. She was trying to make a living to support her kids, sometimes working as many as 3 jobs. The slumlords of the building that they lived in did not take good care of the apartments that Patrisse and her neighbors lived in, and there were no parks or lawns for the kids to play in. And when Patrisse was accepted into what sort of sounded like a gifted program at a mostly white school, she had to get herself there, either public transportation, I think, or maybe her mother was even able to drive her sometimes. And when she got there, she's made friends with some of her classmates and was smoking pot in the girls' bathroom with other girls at school. They were white girls, and there were no police to be found. But when her brother was caught with a little bit of weed out front of their apartment building, he was arrested. What the fuck? Again. Patrisse's story shows us how she became an activist at a very young age and is the story of survival, strength, and resilience, seeking to change the culture in this country that declares that innocent Black life is expendable. I'm glad about Juneteenth being made a federal holiday. I'm behind Black Lives Matter. I am an ally for the Black community, the Asian American and Pacific Islander heritage community, for the LGBTQ plus community, for the Latinx community, for immigrants. I support all religions and minorities and ethnicities and anyone else who's marginalized. I support and respect our veterans, and I want better care for them, for their service, and for the PTSD they suffered as a result. I support all the movements, and I'm for equal pay for women. I get it. I get it all. I'm also so sick and sad that we even need these movements and causes, because why the fuck wouldn't we treat every American well and fairly and the same? Why does the color of one's skin matter or who they love matter? Why have we suppressed women and people of color in the LGBTQ communities? Because the straight white male can't handle that we are all really just the same on the inside. And when we are all free and supported and loved, we are all of equal value and worth. This has been Dee Dee Mendez with Audacious Freedom, the podcast. Thank you for listening, and I can't wait for next time.